Welcome back to the Business Maker Show, brought to you by Comcast Business, built for business. Coming to you now in front of a live audience at the MIT Enterprise Forum. And I'm very pleased to have as my guest Bennett Greenspan, the founder and CEO of Family Tree DNA. Bennett, welcome back to the Business Maker Show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You bet. Tell us about Family Tree DNA.
Well, Family Tree DNA was the growth. It was an outgrowth of interest in genealogy and boredom.
Okay.
And maybe I should say even more specifically, it was the result of my wife saying, "Get a job, learn how to play golf, or go back to your genealogy, but get out of my kitchen."
Right. And get a job you did, man. So there's a lot of people probably in our audience that are watching right now too that think, well, we've been testing DNA for a long time, but that's not true, right?
Well, the first DNA testing was done in the 1980s in England. They actually used it in a criminal setting. They were trying to find a rapist. But from a direct-to-consumer, popular hobbyist standpoint, it's been around only 15 years. I had this eureka moment in the summer of 1999, all because I was trying to prove that I was related to a family in Argentina, that I couldn't find a piece of paper, something that we genealogists consider sacrosanct, that would act as my piece of evidence. And so I thought about my problem and realized I can use the Y chromosome to prove that my cousin in California is related to this fellow in Argentina if I can get them both to agree to test.
Okay, it sounds like you had a scientific background. Do you have a degree?
No, I owned a photographic supply company.
That's close.
So I dealt with lenses and light and those sorts of things, but that was about as scientific as I got. And they say that the fools rush in where wise men dare not tread.
Right.
Had I known the complexity of what I was getting into, I don't know that I would have gotten into it.
Okay.
Because it's real hard science.
Okay. But it's kind of interesting. You were a genealogist at almost too young of an age, right?
Well, I was annoying to the adults at a young age, yes, sir.
And how did that happen?
Well, my grandmother died when I was 12, and later that night when people came to the house to offer their condolences, I was a little kid walking around with a piece of paper and a pencil, saying essentially, "Tell me about, where are you from, and where were your parents from, and what were your aunts and uncles' names, and do you know when they died?" And you wouldn't know when they were born, would you? And it created a lifelong interest in history. It opened up my eyes to the world, because the borders of countries in Europe have done nothing but change, and it allowed me, it gave me a launching pad, as I went to school, and I became a political science major, but I have a minor in history, and this was something that that worked very well with my genealogical interests.
Okay, but this kind of family thing that happened was when you were how old?
I was 12.
Okay, so you were a genealogist at 12.
I was a pretend genealogist at 12. I was interested.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily know what I was doing other than to ask relatives questions.
Yeah.
But at that time, it was, of course, before, the internet, which became the great leveler in the world. I mean, if you wanted to find out facts about relatives 30 years ago, you had to find those relatives, or you had to travel a long distance, or you had to go into a courthouse or go through, musty cemetery records. Now it's become much more accessible to everyone.
Okay, but I'm curious, at like 12 in middle school, did your friends know? Did they think it was a little odd that you were a genealogist?
Well, sure.
But
it's not a normal thing. I mean, most of the kids were out playing sports, and I was, interested in tracking down family. But it's always been something that, I've always been interested in someone's last name and where's that name from and how did did your ancestors get to this country? Because I had my own stories of how our ancestors had gotten to this country, and I always wanted to compare, why we came here and why your family came here, which is part of my interest in history. But when you can personalize that history and make it the history of you, everyone's eyes seem to, go wide and bright.
Okay, that's cool. So, but back to DNA, you mentioned that you had these two cousins you wanted to kind of put together. Give us a little bit more detail about that.
So after I had spoken to Dr. Hammer, and I mentioned that earlier tonight, I wrote up a business plan, sent it to him, called him.
Wait, go back for a while. You figured out that you had a person with the name of your mother's father,
right?
In Buenos Aires, right?
That's correct.
And there was another one in California.
That's correct.
And it was important to you as a genealogist to fill that out on the family tree, but there was...
Look, I wanted to know if they were related.
Okay.
That was my simple quest.
Okay.
I couldn't do it with paper. Okay. So I decided if I can do it with molecular biology, then that's the way to go.
Okay.
And I called up Dr. Hammer, who, I eventually got off the phone. I wrote him a business plan.
But wait, you got his name from where?
From the internet.
Yeah, because of why?
Look, I got it because...
Thomas Jefferson?
Well, there was Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote, Hammer wrote the Kohanim study.
Okay.
He wrote that first study in 1997.
Okay.
But he was listed. I could find the guy.
Okay.
And so I was able to find him, and look, it was almost a local call. I mean, Jobling and the other guys were in England.
Okay.
So I figured I would call him in Arizona. That was convenient. He was almost my time zone.
Right.
And I proposed to him that we do a proof of concept, because I said, look, I'm not a scientist, and if I'm going to be selling this to non-scientists, you need to convince me that this really works. I know you're a professor and you say it works, but I want a proof of concept. And he said, fine, I'll send you out a couple dozen swab kits. Scrape everyone you know. And so that's essentially what I did. I scraped a set of twins. I scraped two people who had the same last name but had come to the United States almost 100 years apart. We tested a couple people with the same name, hoping that they would be related, and we got some very interesting results. In fact, my results showed that my cousin in California, who initially did not want to do this DNA test, by the way, was an exact match to the folks in Buenos Aires. And those two guys didn't match anyone else in my proof of concept, so I knew it was real. And when I saw the results, I said, everyone's going to want this. This is something that's going to be hot in a very staid, little genealogical group.
Okay. And Dr. Hammer kind of is still associated with you today,
Hammer still sits on our advisory board.
Okay. But that first call to him was based on you searching for this.
Absolutely.
Not even knowing if it existed.
That's correct. Right. I called him out of the blue. As I said, he wasn't that anxious to talk to me.
Right.
And but I was persistent.
And he triggered the idea with his response to you.
He did.
Right?
He absolutely did. He provoked an entrepreneur.
Okay, really cool. So it's brought to this. So how long has the company been in business today?
We've been in business 15 years. We've tested between ourselves and the National Geographic Society. We've tested over 1.2 million people.
Okay.
In the last 15 years. And, we're busier this year than we were last year, and we were busier last year than we were the year before.
Okay.
And every time I get a new competitor, it just gets better. Okay? In other words, all they're doing is validating that idea from 15 years ago.
Okay. But it's a little bit controversial, isn't it? I mean, some people don't particularly care to know the answers to what you can give them.
That's correct. And for people who don't want to know the answer, they shouldn't test.
Okay.
If you have anything to hide, or if someone had something to hide, or if you have something you think to lose, you shouldn't do a DNA test. Here's the thing. My customers, most of them are genealogists, which means that we're looking for 3, 4, 5, 6 generations ago. If there was an out-of-wedlock event, Ross, 5 generations ago, who cares?
Right.
It doesn't matter. It's not your mom and your dad that we're talking about here. It's much, much more sensitive when we're dealing with, with paternity testing.
Sure.
It can be devastating.
Sure.
And I've had sometimes multiple brothers test who are expected to match and don't match. But when we start probing as to why they asked the question, we find that typically they expected or they suspected something.
Okay, but aren't there sometimes people, Bennett, that want to know, and because they're not anticipating a problem, and they're surprised?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it happens quite often.
Okay.
It makes for long conversations. Sometimes I feel like I'm in the consoling business.
Wow. You personally sometimes have those conversations?
Absolutely.
Wow.
We have a lot of people who tell us that the DNA lab must have made a mistake.
Right.
No one's perfect. Generally, the DNA lab seems to be more accurate than most of our customers.
Okay.
I would say, we have a program that if someone doesn't believe the results, for half the price, we'll retest them, and then of course, we say we'll refund their money if we were wrong, of course, and wipe the egg off our face. But I can't remember doing that.
Okay. Well, as you know, I recently finally toured the lab, and it is impressive. That's a lot of equipment that costs a lot of money that's running around the clock, right?
Unfortunately, yes, and no. It's not running around the clock. I only wish it was running around the clock.
Okay.
We're probably running 5.5 days a week.
Okay.
Sometimes 6. Sometimes we have equipment that runs over the weekend. But we're busy. One thing I like to tell our employees is that you mentioned we have a lot of equipment in there. There's a lot of robots in there. The reason there's a lot of robots in there is that's kind of the manufacturing production equalizer. So what I try to explain to our folks is that they're not competing with the lab in the medical center, and they're not competing with the lab in Atlanta. They're competing with offshore.
Right.
Because if we lose in America our knowledge-based workers, the people who work with their hands and hold pipettes, and who have decent jobs, who have good jobs, and they're making very reasonable money. If we lose that from our society, I worry about America. And so the only way that we've determined that we can level that playing field is to have those people being ultra productive, which means that anything that we can put on a robot, we're going to put on a robot.
Well, it is very automated and impressive. Before I let you go, I've got to ask you this question. I haven't asked you this one before, but it must feel like you're in the sweet spot of life. Your hobby has turned into just an incredible business where you're answering extremely important questions to people's lives.
I've got a great job. And, I've thought about the other things I've done in my life, and I've always, found enjoyment and pleasure in what I'm doing, but I've never had as much enjoyment or fun as I have in this business. It definitely is not, it's definitely not something that you can have an old thinking mentality and manage well.
Absolutely.
What I found is that the industry is changing so quickly that it forces me to read a lot more scientific journals than sometimes I'd like to admit. But if I don't know what's happening in the industry, I can't think or innovate about what products the general public might be interested in.
Right.
And so it's a great deal. I love it.
Bennett, thanks again for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
And that wraps up my discussion with Bennett Greenspan, the founder and CEO of Family Tree DNA. And this is the Business Maker Show, brought to you by Comcast Business, built for business. Thanks.
Okay.